In the dense heart of the Amazon, a lone adventure vlogger was about to capture the shot of a lifetime. What started as a routine jungle trek took a shocking turn when the ground beneath him suddenly vanished, sending him plummeting into darkness. Ethan Cross wasn't your typical thrill seeker. For years, he had built his reputation exploring the world's most treacherous landscapes, known for his fearless pursuit of the unknown. When he crashed into the cavern below, surrounded by glowing symbols and eerie silence, he had no idea he was stumbling into a secret buried for centuries. He reached for his camera, his instinct always to document, but survival had just become his first priority. What began as a simple search for an untouched view would become the discovery of an ancient civilization hidden beneath the jungle. The world above would never be the same after what Ethan was about to unearth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dense canopy above Ethan Cross formed a living ceiling of emerald and shadow, broken only by golden shafts of sunlight piercing through the cracks. The jungle pulsed with life, chirping cicadas, distant howler monkeys, and the ever-present hum of unseen insects. It was exactly what his audience craved. Ethan wiped a line of sweat from his brow, adjusting the camera strap to his chest. "All right, guys, this is the part where it gets interesting." His voice was steady, masking the exhaustion creeping into his limbs. The trek had been brutal, thick undergrowth, merciless humidity, and 100 ways to get lost. But he wasn't here for comfort. He was here for the shot, for the discovery, for the rush that came with venturing where few dared. Rumors of a hidden trail deep within the Amazon had circulated through obscure adventure forums. A secluded peak untouched by civilization, promising a view no one had captured before. Ethan had followed the breadcrumbs, half myth, half local whispers, until they led him here, to the heart of the unknown. He stepped carefully over gnarled roots and loose stone, pausing only to adjust his drone. The compact quadcopter whirred to life, lifting into the air and pushing forward through the trees. The live feed flickered on his phone, revealing glimpses of jagged cliffs and dense foliage ahead. "There it is," he muttered, breath-catching. "The ridge." If the rumors were true, the view beyond it would be nothing short of legendary. He picked up his pace, carefully maneuvering toward the edge. Then the ground gave way. For a split second, there was nothing beneath him, just empty air. His stomach lurched as gravity seized him, and the world tilted into a free fall. Branches snapped around him, the weight of his pack throwing him off balance as he tumbled down a steep ravine. Rocks tore at his arms and legs. The camera rig slammed against his chest. He twisted mid-fall, reaching for something, anything, to stop his descent. But his fingers scraped against nothing but dirt and air. Then, impact. Darkness swallowed him. A throbbing ache dragged Ethan back to consciousness. He groaned, his body sprawled awkwardly over damp earth and scattered debris. His fingers curled against the dirt, and he inhaled sharply as a sharp pain flared through his ribs. Slowly, carefully, he rolled onto his back, staring upward. No sky, just a ceiling of rock and hanging vines, stretching high above him like the inside of a massive cavern. Faint, ghostly blue light shimmered along the walls, illuminating the space in an eerie, bioluminescent glow. What the hell? Ethan pushed himself upright, wincing. His gear was in disarray, his backpack hung loosely. Off one shoulder, the strap half torn from the fall. His camera, miraculously still attached to his harness, blinked its red recording light at him. The drone was nowhere to be seen. He ran a quick assessment. Minor scrapes, a possible bruised rib, but nothing broken. He exhaled in relief before reaching for his pack. He had water, a small med kit, an extra battery pack, and a few protein bars. Not ideal, but enough to get him moving. His head turned as his eyes adjusted to the dim glow. The cavern was massive, easily the size of a football field, with walls marked by strange ancient carvings, spirals and glyphs that felt purposeful. "Jesus," he breathed, switching his camera to night mode for a better look. The symbols weren't random. They depicted something, figures standing beneath what looked like an enormous sun, their hands raised. Others knelt before a massive structure, its outline vaguely resembling a temple. This wasn't just rock. This was history. Ethan's journalistic instincts kicked in, overriding the dull ache in his bones. He raised his camera, zooming in on the carvings. Okay, this is something else. If anyone's watching this later, a sound. Soft. Barely more than a whisper. Ethan froze, his pulse spiking. His breath caught in his throat as he slowly turned his head toward the darkness beyond the glowing flora. A figure, just beyond the reach of the light. He wasn't alone. A chill crawled up his spine. The figure was motionless, watching. Then, silently as it had appeared, it melted into the shadows. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears, his grip tightened on the camera. Shit. Alone in an unknown world surrounded by secrets buried beneath the earth, he had only two choices. Try to climb back up the way he fell or follow the path deeper into the unknown. His gaze drifted toward the ancient stone pathway leading into the cavern's depths. Ethan swallowed hard. Something told him that turning back wasn't an option. Ethan's breath was shallow as he took his first step onto the ancient stone pathway. The blue glow of bioluminescent flora cast eerie shadows, shifting as he moved. His pulse was still hammering from the shadowy figure's silent departure, but his mind was already pushing past the fear. He had to document this. His camera was still recording, capturing the strange carvings, the alien glow of the cavern, the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing. This is unbelievable, he whispered, mostly to himself. This isn't just a cave. This is a hidden world. He adjusted his camera harness and followed the path cautiously, stepping over damp stone slabs that had been worn smooth by time. The air felt different, thicker, charged with something unseen, like the quiet hum of a storm before lightning strikes. Then a rustle. Movement from the darkness. Ethan turned, too late. A sudden force struck him from behind, knocking him forward. Rough hands seized his arms, yanking them back before he could react. His instinct screamed to fight, but before he could twist free, something cold and metallic pressed against his wrist. A restraint? No, not metal. Something stronger. Something alive. He barely had time to process it before a sharp pain erupted at the base of his neck. A pressure point? A nerve strike? His body seized, muscles locking for a brief, terrifying second before his vision blurred. The last thing he saw before darkness swallowed him was the glow of his camera light reflecting off-masked faces. When Ethan's consciousness returned, he wasn't lying on stone anymore. He was moving. No, being carried. His vision swam as he struggled to piece together his surroundings. Silhouettes loomed around him, their features obscured by intricate bone-white masks. They carried him on a sort of platform. Woven fabric, stretched between carved poles, moving rhythmically as unseen hands bore him forward. The cavern was no longer just a cavern. It was massive. Structures rose from the darkness, towering spires, bridges suspended over nothingness, glowing streams of what looked like liquid light flowing through channels carved into the rock. The city was alive. Katal'Zir, Ethan barely had time to register the sheer scale before he was hauled upright and dropped onto cold stone. He barely caught himself before his knees hit the ground. The air smelled of damp earth, burning incense, and something metallic. Ozone? It was as if the air itself carried an electric charge. Voices murmured in a language he didn't understand, the words sharp and clipped. The figures surrounding him stood tall, their garments layered in intricate angular designs woven from dark fabric. Their masks varied, some smooth and expressionless, others etched with symbols. But their eyes were sharp, watching him with a mixture of suspicion and something else. Fear? Contempt? Ethan lifted his hands slowly, palms open in what he hoped was a universal gesture of surrender. His voice came out hoarse. He swallowed and tried again. "I don't want any trouble." No response. His camera was still strapped to his chest, the red light blinking faintly, but he doubted it was recording anything useful now. He was kneeling at the foot of a colossal structure, an immense hall carved from the cavern itself. Towering columns flanked the entrance, each embedded with glowing crystal veins that pulsed faintly, casting an eerie blue-green light. The figures parted as someone stepped forward, a woman. Unlike the others, she did not wear a mask. Her face was sharp, her features framed by dark braids woven with golden threads. Her eyes, a piercing shade of amber, locked onto his with unreadable intensity. "You should not be here." The words were flawless, not just in pronunciation, but in tone. Calm, assessing, controlled. Ethan exhaled, relief flickering through his confusion. "You speak English." The woman tilted her head slightly. "I speak many things." He struggled to his feet, resisting the hands that tried to keep him down. "Look, He hesitated. What did he even say? "I fell through the ground into your secret civilization?" That was the truth, but it sounded absurd even in his own head. "I didn't mean to come here," he settled on. "That does not matter." Her tone remained impassive. "Your presence alone is a disruption." Ethan scanned her face, searching for any hint of an ally. "What's your name?" She hesitated for only a fraction of a second. "Zira." His gut told him that she was important. Someone with authority, but not the final authority. Movement stirred behind her. A new figure emerged from the shadows of the great hall. This one didn't wear a mask either, but there was no mistaking the difference. Where Zira held herself with the wary tension of a warrior, the man before him carried the weight of something much heavier. Power. His robes were layered, woven with threads that shimmered faintly under the crystal glow. His face was marked with faint, almost imperceptible lines, not wrinkles, not scars. Something else. Something unnatural. His eyes were ancient. Ethan knew immediately that this man was in charge. Zira took a step back, bowing her head slightly. "Chancellor," she said. "Chancellor." Ethan's mind locked onto the word. The man, high. Chancellor Vekkar studied him with a calculating gaze. Not fear, not suspicion. Just cold, quiet analysis. "You are an anomaly," Vekkar said at last, his voice deep and steady. Ethan forced himself to meet the man's gaze. I don't know what that means." Vekkar tilted his head slightly. "It means you should not exist in our world." The word sent a fresh ripple of unease through Ethan's spine. Vekkar turned his gaze to the guards. "Prepare him." Ethan's stomach tightened. "Prepare me for what?" No one answered. Zira's gaze flickered, something unreadable flashing behind her otherwise controlled expression. Ethan felt his arms wrenched behind him once more as the guards closed in, restraining him. His pulse spiked. This wasn't just captivity. This was a trial, and whatever their laws were, he had no doubt they weren't in his favor. Ethan's wrists burned against the restraints as he was led deeper into the great hall of Katal'Zir. The path before him stretched impossibly far, lined with towering columns carved with intricate patterns that pulsed with veins of faint blue light. Shadows moved among the stone, figures draped in flowing robes standing at attention along the walls. The council was waiting. His boots scraped against the smooth stone as he was forced forward. He kept his head up despite the weight pressing on his shoulders, the weight of a world he didn't understand, the weight of his own survival hanging by a thread. The chamber at the end of the hall widened into a vast, circular room. At its center, an elevated dais loomed above the floor where a half-circle of robed figures sat in silence. The High Council. At their center, flanked by 2 guards, stood High Chancellor Vekkar. The air in the chamber was thick, not just with tension but with something else. A presence. The room felt charged, as if the very walls were alive, listening. Ethan's escort shoved him forward, forcing him to his knees. Silence followed. Then, Vekkar spoke. You are an intruder in a world that is not yours. His voice carried effortlessly through the chamber, filling every crevice with its weight. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing his breath to remain steady. I didn't come here on purpose. Vekkar's gaze was unwavering. Intent does not absolve. Consequence. A murmur rippled through the council. Ethan's eyes flicked to Zira standing at the edge of the room. Unlike the others, she wasn't seated. She wasn't silent. Her arms were crossed, her expression unreadable. Another voice spoke. One of the council members, an elder woman with streaks of silver in her hair. What do you seek here, outsider? Ethan hesitated. I didn't seek anything. I fell through the ground. I was exploring, documenting. He felt the weight of the camera strapped to his chest, still there, though powered off. Vekkar's eyes darkened. You came as a seeker of knowledge, but knowledge has a price. He stepped forward, the movement slow and deliberate. Tell me, what is your world's price for secrets best left buried? Ethan frowned. I don't... Another voice interrupted. The heart. Ethan turned toward the speaker. A man, older than Vekkar but carrying himself with the same quiet authority. His robes were different, marked with patterns Ethan hadn't seen before. He was not of the ruling caste, but he held knowledge. Oren, Ethan's, gaze locked onto him as Oren stepped forward. You know nothing of Katal'Zir, and yet you are here. Oren's voice was smoother than Vekkar's, less commanding but no less powerful. You stand at the threshold of a city that has endured for longer than your history can comprehend. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. How long? A pause. Then, Oren smiled, but it was not a kind smile, long enough to remember the last time an outsider arrived. A hush fell over the chamber. Ethan's fingers curled into fists. What happened to them? No one answered. Instead, Vekkar's gaze sharpened. Your presence alone is disruption. Your knowledge of us is a threat. He turned to the council. We cannot allow this. Ethan felt the shift in the air, the growing certainty of the council's verdict. He wasn't here for negotiation. This wasn't a debate. This was sentencing. You can't be serious, Ethan said, his voice rising. I didn't do anything. I don't even know what you are. The heart of Katal'Zir, Oren said, watching him carefully. It is our lifeblood, the source of all that sustains us. Ethan latched onto the words. An energy source, he said. Something not natural? Oren's gaze didn't waver. Perhaps it is not your place to ask such questions. Vekkar's patience was thinning. Enough. He does not belong here. He cannot leave. Ethan stiffened. What does that mean? Vekkar turned to the council. There is only one answer. His meaning was clear. Execution. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs, but before the words could solidify into a sentence, another voice cut through the chamber. No. Zira. Ethan's head snapped toward her, as did the council's. Zira stepped forward, her gaze locked onto Vekkar's. He is here now. Killing him does nothing. Vekkar's expression darkened. It ensures our secrecy. Zira's voice was steady. It ensures nothing. You want to erase him, but what if he is the answer? A tense pause. Zira turned to the council. The prophecy, the one the elders refused to speak of. Ethan saw the flicker of unease in some of the council members. A prophecy? He had no idea what she was talking about, but the way the words landed in the chamber told him it was something important. Something dangerous. Vekkar's voice was cold. You speak of myths. Do I? Zira's gaze sharpened. Or are you afraid he is something more than an inconvenience? Ethan's throat felt dry. He didn't know what she was doing, if she was helping him, or if she had her own motives, but it was the first crack in Vekkar's absolute control. Oren, watching the exchange carefully, turned toward Ethan. Do you wish to live? The question caught Ethan off guard. What kind of question is that? A test, Oren said simply. Ethan met his gaze. I want to live, but not just to survive. I want to understand. The council murmured again. Oren nodded as if that was the answer he had expected. Vekkar exhaled sharply, turning back to the council. If you allow him to stay, the burden of his actions must fall on someone. Zyra's jaw tensed. Vekkar's gaze settled on her. You spoke for him, Vekkar said. Then you are responsible for him. The words were a cage. Ethan saw the flicker of tension in Zyra's posture, but she did not back down. So be it, she said. Vekkar turned back to Ethan, and though the verdict was no longer execution, the cold edge of his gaze made one thing clear. Ethan was not free. He was a prisoner, and whatever fate Katal'Zir had in store for him, it was only beginning. Ethan moved through the streets of Katal'Zir under Zyra's watchful gaze. His every step measured, every glance weighed. His wrists were no longer bound, but he wasn't free. Not really. The city was unlike anything he had ever seen. Towering. Structures of dark stone and glowing crystal loomed over winding pathways, their surfaces adorned with carvings that pulsed faintly, as if alive. Narrow bridges arched between platforms, suspended over rivers of liquid light that flowed through, channels carved deep into the rock. The air smelled of damp stone, burning incense, and something metallic, ozone maybe, or something else entirely. A civilization untouched by time. Hidden. Alive. Zyra led him through the city's corridors with purpose, her expression unreadable. You wanted to understand, she said as they walked. Then look, Ethan did. He saw the beauty first, the glowing flora that climbed the walls like living veins, the murals etched into stone that told stories older than anything he had ever studied. The people moved with a quiet grace, their garments woven from rich fabrics, their eyes sharp and knowing. But then he saw the other side. The enforcers, clad in dark robes adorned with metallic symbols, they stood at key intersections, watching. Their presence was silent, but their purpose was clear. They were the ones who ensured secrecy, the ones who ensured order. Ethan's stomach twisted. This place, he muttered, adjusting the camera still strapped to his chest, its light off, but its memory card intact. It's more than just hidden. It's controlled. Zyra's gaze flicked toward him. You see quickly. Ethan exhaled. The people here. Do they want to stay hidden? Zyra was silent for a long moment. Some do. Her voice was quieter now. Some have never known anything else. To them, this is the only world. And the ones who don't? She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. They passed a marketplace where merchants bartered with goods, woven fabrics, glowing gemstones, dried herbs that smelled unfamiliar. Children played near the edge of a cascading waterfall, their laughter echoing in the cavernous space. It was a city that thrived, and yet the presence of the enforcers was everywhere. Ethan knew that kind of presence. He had seen it before in places where the truth was a dangerous thing. You spoke against Vekkar, he said carefully. That's not normal, is it? Zyra's jaw tensed. No. You don't trust him. No, she said again, but this time, there was more weight behind it. Ethan let the silence linger before asking the next question. Then why are you part of all this? She stopped walking. For the first time, she turned fully toward him, her amber eyes searching his face. Because I was born into it. Because Katal'Zir is more than its rulers. A pause. Because I believe it can be more than what it is. Ethan's mind turned the words over. She isn't just enforcing the rules. She's questioning them. Are there others like you? He asked, a flicker of hesitation, then a whisper. There are always others. That night, when Zyra believed he was asleep, Ethan turned on his camera. He sat in the small chamber he had been given. Bare stone walls, a single woven mat for a bed, a dimly glowing crystal embedded in the ceiling casting soft light. He looked into the lens. This is Ethan Cross, he whispered, voice barely above a breath. I don't know if this will ever make it to the surface, but if it does, this is real. Katal'Zir is real. He exhaled. It's beautiful, but it's not free. He paused, listening. When he was sure no one was outside his door, he continued. There's something here, some kind of power, something ancient. His fingers tightened around the camera. I don't know if I should be filming this, but I can't stop. Then he heard voices, muffled, not from outside, but from beneath. He turned off the camera and pressed his ear against the floor. The stone was thick, but the words bled through. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Two voices, Zira's and Oren's. He is dangerous, Oren was saying. Ethan's pulse spiked. He is curious, Zira countered. That is enough. A pause, then Oren's voice again. You do not know what is coming. Zira's reply was softer. Then tell me. A longer silence, then Oren whispered something Ethan barely caught. The heart is failing. Ethan's breath hitched. He didn't know what the heart was. Not yet. But something told him that failing wasn't just a metaphor. Something told him that Katal'Zir's greatest secret wasn't just its existence, it was its survival. Ethan couldn't sleep. Not after what he had heard. The heart is failing. The words looped in his mind, sharpening the edges of his exhaustion into something restless and urgent. He sat in his chamber, staring at the dim blue glow of the crystal embedded in the ceiling. The air in Katal'Zir carried a weight he couldn't quite define, something electric, humming beneath the surface of everything. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to get them sitting here. Carefully, he adjusted the camera on his harness, making sure it was secure but dark. He moved toward the door, testing the handle. Unlocked. Zira had left him under supervision, but she hadn't locked him in. Then she's either starting to trust me, or testing me. Ethan slipped into the corridor, keeping to the shadows, as he moved through the quiet city. The bioluminescent veins in the walls pulsed gently, illuminating the stone pathways in ghostly blue light. The streets were nearly empty, the only movement coming from the occasional enforcer patrolling in the distance. He needed to find Oren. If anyone knew what was happening here, it was him. But instead, he found something else. A library, or something, close to it. The entrance was carved into the rock face, flanked by two statues, figures cloaked in long robes, their hands outstretched. The chamber beyond was lined with rows of stone tablets, scrolls, and what looked like aged manuscripts, their surfaces etched with symbols too intricate for Ethan to decipher at a glance. His pulse quickened. Carefully, he stepped inside. Rows of ancient texts lined the space, their pages preserved in thick glass casings. Symbols pulsed faintly with embedded light. Not quite paper, not quite stone. Something else. The room smelled of old parchment and something faintly metallic, like charged air before a storm. Ethan moved toward one of the central stone tablets, its carvings deeper than the others. Unlike the other texts, this one wasn't locked away. It was waiting. Slowly, he traced a hand over the surface, feeling the rough etchings beneath his fingertips. The images told a story. A great city rising from the depths. A civilization thriving beneath the surface. A structure at its center. A pulsing core of light. The heart. Then, destruction. The next panel showed fire. Not the kind that burned wood, but something else. Light swallowing everything. The symbols around it radiated outward in jagged patterns as if the earth itself was breaking apart. And standing at the center of it all, an outsider. Ethan's stomach twisted. He leaned in closer, squinting at the symbols beneath the image. The language was unfamiliar, but something about the arrangement felt structured, meant to be understood. He activated his camera, recording the text. His mind raced. If I can get out of here, maybe I can analyze it later. A voice shattered the silence. You shouldn't be here. Ethan's heart leapt into his throat as he turned. Zira stood at the entrance, arms crossed, her amber eyes sharp, in the dim glow. She stepped forward, her voice low but urgent. Do you even understand what that is? Ethan exhaled. I think it's a prophecy. Zira's jaw tightened. A myth. Or a warning. Ethan motioned to the symbols. It talks about destruction, fire, and someone like me. Zira's expression flickered. Not shock, not disbelief. Something else. Recognition. Ethan narrowed his eyes. You knew about this. She hesitated. Everyone in Katal'Zir knows of the prophecy. It is told as a cautionary tale, one meant to ensure our people do not seek what lies above. Her voice was steady, but there was a tension beneath it. It is a tool of control. Ethan wasn't so sure. He turned back to the tablet. What if it's real? Zira inhaled sharply. Then we are already doomed. A presence stirred behind them. Ethan barely had time to react before the air shifted, heavy with something unseen. A deep, steady voice filled the chamber. The prophecy has always been real. Ethan turned sharply. Oren stood in the doorway, watching them both with his measured, knowing gaze. Zira stiffened. You don't believe that. Oren stepped forward, his robes trailing lightly over the stone floor. Belief is irrelevant. What matters is that Vekkar does. His gaze shifted to Ethan. And now that you have seen it, he will do whatever it takes to silence you. Ethan's stomach tightened. Then I need to get out of here. Oren tilted his head slightly. Where would you go, outsider? Ethan had no answer. Zira sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. Vekkar has already increased security since you arrived. If you disappear now, it will only confirm his worst fears. Her gaze darkened. And he does not react kindly to fear. Ethan swallowed. So what? I just sit here and wait for him to decide whether or not I get to keep breathing? No. Zira's jaw tightened. We find out the truth. Ethan frowned. You don't think this is the truth? He motioned to the prophecy. Oren's voice was quiet. Prophecies are interpretations of the past disguised as visions of the future. Ethan shook his head. No, that's not just metaphor, that's real. That fire, that destruction, it's something big, something catastrophic. Zira's gaze locked onto his. Then we need to know why. A long silence settled between them. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He didn't like this. He didn't like any of this. His instinct screamed at him to leave, to run, to find a way back to the surface before this turned into something worse. But it was already worse, and he knew himself too well. He wasn't going to walk away. He met Zira's gaze and nodded. Okay. She held his stare for a moment before turning back to Oren. If we're going to figure out the truth, we need to start at the source. Oren's expression remained unreadable. Then you already know where you must go, Ethan. Frowned. Where? Zira's voice was quiet. The heart of Katal'Zir. Ethan felt a cold weight settle in his chest. The prophecy had spoken of fire. The city was built around an energy source. And if something was failing, Ethan wasn't sure what scared him more, that he might have caused this, or that he might be too late to stop it. The corridors beneath Katal'Zir were colder than the city above, the air thick with dampness and an eerie stillness. Ethan followed, Zira through the winding stone tunnels, their only illumination the faint blue glow of embedded crystals lining the walls. Each step they took echoed slightly, swallowed quickly by the pressing weight of the underground. How deep does this go? Ethan whispered, his breath visible in the chill. Deep, Zira replied curtly, keeping her voice low. Few know of these passages. Even fewer are permitted to walk them. Ethan kept close as they descended another level, the narrow staircase twisting sharply. The further they went, the more the stonework changed, losing its smooth carvings and intricate symbols, becoming raw, untouched rock. This was older than the city above, much older. Oren had not come with them. His parting words had been cryptic as ever. If you go, you may learn the truth. But truths do not always bring salvation. Ethan wasn't sure what that meant. He wasn't sure he wanted to, but he needed to know. Ahead, Zyra finally stopped before an ancient doorway, its surface covered in glyphs unlike anything Ethan had seen in Katal'Zir so far. The symbols weren't just carved. They pulsed, as though something beneath the surface was alive. Zyra turned to him. Once we go through, there is no turning back. Ethan met her gaze. I wasn't planning on it. With a deep breath, she pressed her palm against the center of the door. The moment her skin made contact, the glyphs flared with a cold white light, different from the warm bioluminescence of the city above. The air vibrated, the charge humming against Ethan's skin. Then the door moved, not slid, not creaked. It shifted as though reality itself was bending, folding away to reveal the chamber beyond. Ethan took a step forward and froze. This wasn't a room. This was a relic. The chamber stretched impossibly far, its ceiling lost in darkness. Massive spires jutted from the walls, each covered in more glowing symbols, their light flickering like dying stars. The air was heavier here, thick with an energy Ethan could feel humming beneath his skin. At the center of the chamber stood a structure unlike anything else in Katal'Zir. It wasn't stone, it wasn't carved, it was machinery. A massive, pulsing core of light floated within an intricate metal frame, its surface shifting between hues of deep blue and iridescent silver. Cables, or were they roots, extended from its base, threading deep into the cavern walls like veins feeding the city above. Ethan's pulse pounded. This isn't natural, he muttered, stepping closer. He could hear it. A deep, rhythmic thrum, almost like breathing. Zyra's voice was quiet. This is the heart of Katal'Zir. Ethan turned toward her. This is technology, he said. Not just an energy source, this thing, it's alive. Zyra looked away. It has kept our city thriving for centuries. Without it, we would have perished long ago. Ethan scanned the structure. You said the energy is failing. Shipa nodded. It grows weaker every year. Our people do not see it, but I do. The pulses are dimming. The heat is fading. Ethan felt a chill crawl down his spine. And no one questions it? Zyra's jaw tightened. Vekkar keeps the truth buried. He tells our people that the heart is eternal, that we must not disturb its balance. But I have seen the cracks forming. Oren has seen them too. Ethan turned back to the pulsating core. This isn't some sacred artifact. This is something else, something old. His breath caught as a terrifying realization hit him. And something unnatural. Zyra hesitated. What are you saying? Ethan swallowed hard. This wasn't built by your people. Silence. Zyra stared at him, and for the first time Ethan saw something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Fear. She turned away, pacing. You cannot say such things. You've thought it? Ethan countered. This. He gestured to the core. This is not the work of an ancient civilization. This is something else entirely. Something not of this world. Zyra exhaled sharply. You speak dangerously. Ethan shook his head. No, Zyra. What's dangerous is pretending this is just some mystical force. You're relying on something you don't understand. I understand enough, she snapped, but there was uncertainty behind her words. Ethan turned back to the heart, the flickering pulses of light, the whispering hum beneath the air, the sheer unnatural presence of it. It was failing. And if it stopped altogether, Ethan exhaled. If this thing shuts down, your city won't just be without power. It might not survive at all. Zyra's fists clenched. That is why Vekkar will do anything to keep it stable. Ethan turned toward her, realization dawning. That's why he wants me gone. Zyra didn't deny it. Because if I find out the truth, Ethan's voice was low. Then others will too. A sudden noise echoed through the chamber. Voice, step away. Ethan's stomach dropped. Zyra spun, reaching for the blade at her belt. But they were already surrounded. Dark figures emerged from the shadows, their robes embroidered with the sigil of the High Council. Their weapons gleamed in the dim light, sharp and waiting. At their center, standing as still and cold as stone, Vekkar. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with quiet fury. "I warned you, Zyra," he said, his voice measured. Controlled. "You have overstepped." Ethan's breath turned sharp. He looked back at the heart, then at Vekkar, then at Zyra. They had been caught, and this time, he wasn't sure they'd make it out alive. Ethan barely had time to react before hands seized his arms, wrenching him backward. The enforcers moved with the precision of men trained for control, their grips iron tight, their expressions unreadable behind their masks. Zyra struggled against them, but there were too many. High Chancellor Vekkar stood motionless, the blue glow of the heart casting stark shadows across his face. His expression was one of quiet finality. "I warned you," he said, his voice carrying through the chamber. "Your presence has already begun to unravel what we have built." Ethan gritted his teeth, yanking against the enforcer's grip. "You don't even know what you're protecting. That thing, whatever it is failing." Vekkar's gaze flicked to him. "You mistake secrecy for ignorance, outsider. The heart of Katal'Zir is not yours to question." Ethan's stomach twisted. "He knows." Vekkar turned to Zyra, his expression hardening. "And you, daughter of the ruling caste, trained as a guardian of our ways." His voice was laced with quiet contempt. "Yet you lead an intruder into the most sacred chamber. You disgrace your bloodline." Zyra didn't flinch. "I serve Katal'Zir, not your lies." Murmurs spread through the enforcers. Some hesitated. Zyra was one of their own. But the power of fear was stronger than loyalty. Vekkar's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. "Ethan Cross is an enemy of Katal'Zir. He will be executed." Ethan's breath turned sharp. Vekkar continued. "And you, Zyra, you will be confined. Until you remember where your true loyalties lie." Two enforcers stepped forward, gripping Zyra's arms. She fought them, but it was no use. "Vekkar," she growled, "you are sealing your own fate." His expression didn't change. "No, I am preserving the only fate that matters." Ethan thrashed against his captors. "You're making a mistake." Vekkar finally turned to him, stepping closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "The mistake was letting you breathe this long." Then, the command came, "Take him!" The enforcers hauled Ethan away, dragging him through the dark corridors beneath the city. They didn't take him to the execution chambers. Ethan was thrown into a small, dimly lit cell, the heavy stone door sealing behind him with a dull thud. He lay still for a moment, catching his breath. "Why not kill me now?" His answer came minutes later. The door creaked open. A figure stepped inside, moving carefully, quietly. Oren. Ethan pushed himself up, warily watching the elder man. "I told you," Oren said, his voice low. "Truth does not bring salvation." Ethan exhaled sharply. "And yet you're here." Oren studied him for a long moment. Then, in a slow, measured movement, he reached into the folds of his robe and pulled out a small, curved blade. He tossed it at Ethan's feet. "Cut your bindings," he said. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed the blade, slicing through the thick rope wrapped around his wrists. The moment he was free, he looked up. "Why are you helping me?" Oren's expression remained unreadable. "Because I do not believe you were meant to die here. Not yet." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "You don't sound convinced." Oren exhaled. "I am a keeper of knowledge, outsider. But knowledge is a dangerous thing. If you remain here, Vekkar will silence you. Permanently." Ethan clenched his jaw. "And Zyra?" "She is alive. For now." That wasn't good enough. Oren stepped toward the door, cracking it open. "There is a passage beneath this prison, a tunnel once used by the old bloodlines to flee in times of war. Use it." Ethan hesitated. "And then what?" Oren finally met his gaze. "Find the ones who do not believe in Vekkar's rule." If you wish to fight for your life, you will not fight alone. Ethan swallowed hard. The rebels. This was no longer about escaping. This was about choosing a side. He gripped the knife tighter. Oren's voice softened. You have little time. Ethan took a steadying breath. Then he stepped into the darkness. The tunnels beneath Katal'Zir stretched endlessly into darkness. Ethan moved carefully through the winding pathways, his pulse steady but his mind racing. Oren's whispered directions had guided him here, to the deepest veins of the city where the shadows hid more than just the forgotten. The rebels lived here, and they were waiting. The tunnel widened into a cavern, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and burning resin. Torches flickered along the rock walls, casting jagged shadows. Ethan slowed his steps, his instincts screaming caution. Then, the voices. Low murmurs, the sound of weapons being drawn. A figure stepped into the firelight. A woman, tall and battle-worn, her hair shaved on one side, deep scars running along her jaw. Her eyes were sharp, assessing him like a predator would size up prey. You're the outsider. Ethan met her gaze. I'm Ethan. She didn't respond. Instead, she tilted her head toward the others lurking in the darkness. More figures emerged, each carrying the same hardened presence. Warriors, survivors, outcasts, rebels. A man stepped forward, his arms crossed over his chest. You shouldn't be here. Ethan clenched his fists. Vekkar thinks I'm a threat. He wants me dead. If you're fighting against him, then that makes us allies. The woman exhaled through her nose. Allies are earned, not declared. Ethan could feel their distrust pressing against him. He had seen that look before. People who had lost too much, who knew betrayal too well. If you wanted me dead, Ethan said carefully, you wouldn't be talking to me. A silence stretched. Then a second voice broke through. He's with me. Ethan turned, his breath caught. Zira. She stood at the entrance of the cavern, flanked by two rebels. Her wrists bore the faint marks of bindings, but her stance was strong, defiant. Ethan exhaled. You're alive. Zira strode forward, her gaze flicking to the rebel leaders. He's not our enemy, the woman scoffed. He's an outsider, that's worse. Ethan clenched his jaw. I didn't ask to be here. The man who had spoken earlier stepped forward. But you are here. And that means you've seen things that should have stayed buried. Ethan felt Zira's gaze on him. He hesitated. Then made his choice. I saw the heart. The room shifted, the murmurs returned, whispers laced with urgency and fear. The woman's expression darkened. Then you've seen our cage. Ethan frowned. What? Zira turned to him, her voice lower. Now, Katal'Zir was not always underground. Ethan felt his pulse spike. What are you saying? The woman stepped forward, her voice carrying an edge of old anger. Vekkar has told our people for generations that the surface was never ours, that we have always been here beneath the world. Ethan swallowed. But that's a lie. The woman's eyes burned. Yes. Zira exhaled. The truth was buried long ago, but the heart remembers. Ethan's mind reeled. This wasn't just about secrecy. This was about control. Ethan looked around the cavern, at the rebels, at their wary eyes, their clenched fists. You want to take back the city, he said. But what happens if it collapses before you even get the chance? The woman frowned. What are you saying? Ethan took a step forward. The heart is failing. If you start a war, you might not be fighting over a city at all. You might be fighting in the ruins of one. The silence was heavy. Zira met Ethan's gaze. Then we need to find the truth. The rebel leader studied them both. Then she nodded. Then we do it our way. Ethan took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. Ethan sat alone in the dim glow of a flickering torch, his back pressed against the cool stone of the underground hideout. The rebels' whispers filled the cavern beyond, strategizing, planning, waiting for the next inevitable move against Vekkar. But Ethan wasn't listening. He was focused on something else. His hands moved carefully over his communication device, the casing dented from his fall, the screen cracked but still faintly glowing. It had been a long shot trying to repair it. Katal'Zir's subterranean interference made contact with the outside nearly impossible. But the device wasn't completely dead, and if there was even a chance he could reach out, a sudden flicker, static, a fragmented screen, then a voice. Dan? Ethan? If you can hear, damn it, please. His breath hitched. Lena. The signal was weak, barely more than broken syllables. He adjusted the receiver, his fingers shaking. Lena, he whispered. I'm here. I'm alive. The static crackled, swallowing his words. Then, more fragments. Search team, days out, close. Can't hold them back. Ethan's heart pounded. They were looking for him. And they were close. A voice interrupted from behind him. What are you doing? Ethan spun. Zyra. She stood in the entrance, her face tense, her amber eyes narrowed. Ethan turned back to the device. It's my producer. She's been looking for me. Zyra took a step closer, her gaze sharp with suspicion. And you thought reaching out was a good idea? Ethan clenched his jaw. I needed to let her know I'm alive. Zyra's expression darkened. And what happens if she finds you? Ethan's pulse hammered. She's already close, he said, his voice quieter now. There's a search team in the jungle. If they find the entrance, Zyra's eyes burned. Then Katal'Zir dies. Ethan pushed to his feet. You don't know that. I do, she snapped. Vekkar would rather bury this city than let outsiders in. If your people come, if they dig, if they search, he will destroy everything. Ethan exhaled sharply. Then maybe that's what it takes to stop him. The air between them tensed. Zyra's fists clenched at her sides. You don't understand what you're saying. I understand that I have people up there looking for me. His voice was steady, but his chest was tight. And if they keep looking, they might die too. Silence. For the first time, Ethan saw something flicker in Zyra's expression. Not just anger. Fear. She stepped closer, her voice quieter now. You don't belong here, she said. And I don't belong up there. But if you call them, if you let them find us, she hesitated, then softer. Everything will change. Ethan swallowed hard. Maybe it needs to. Zyra's breath hitched. Then, a distant boom. A shudder ran through the cavern. Dust rained from the ceiling. Then, voices, shouts. The rebels burst into the chamber, weapons drawn. The enforcers, one of them spat, their breath ragged. They found us. Ethan's stomach dropped. Vekkar's forces had come, and there was no running now. The first explosion sent a shockwave through the cavern, knocking Ethan backward. Dust and debris rained from the ceiling, and the low, ominous groan of shifting stone filled the air. Shouts erupted all around him. The rebels scrambled, some reaching for weapons, others for escape routes. But the attack had been precise. The enforcers were already here. Ethan pushed himself up, coughing through the dust. Zyra was beside him, already drawing her twin blades. Her amber eyes burned with fury as she turned toward the chaos. They found us, Ethan gasped. They betrayed us, Zyra corrected, scanning the cavern. Through the swirling dust, dark figures emerged, Vekkar's enforcers, moving with brutal efficiency. Their weapons, long-bladed staffs humming with energy, carved through the dim light. Rebels met them head-on, but they were outnumbered. Ethan saw the first kill, a rebel cut down mid-charge, his body crumpling to the ground. A second explosion rocked the cavern. A slab of stone from the ceiling cracked, then collapsed, cutting off part of the underground tunnels. Zyra cursed under her breath. We have to move. Ethan spun toward the others. We need to fall back. A rebel, blood trickling from a wound at his temple, grabbed his arm. There's no fallback. We either fight or die. A piercing whine cut through the air. Ethan turned just in time to see an enforcer leveling a weapon at him. Zyra lunged. The enforcer barely had time to react before Zyra's blade tore across his throat. A spray of dark crimson misted the air as the man collapsed. Ethan exhaled, sharply. I'll never get used to that. Zyra wiped her blade on her sleeve, eyes scanning the battlefield. Then don't look. A rebel sprinted toward them, panic in her voice. Zyra, we're losing ground, the tunnels... Another explosion drowned her out. The room lurched. Cracks ran through the cavern walls. Zyra clenched her jaw. We can't hold this position. Ethan's mind raced. If they didn't get out now, they'd be buried alive. But there was nowhere to go. Every path they had was collapsing. Unless... A hand grabbed his shoulder. Ethan turned. Oren. The elder's face was tense, but his voice remained eerily calm. Follow me. Zyra hesitated. Where? Oren's eyes flicked to the carnage behind them. To the only place Vekkar does not control. Ethan swallowed. He didn't like the way Oren said that, but at this point, they had no choice. Go, he said. Zyra nodded. They moved. Oren led them through a jagged split in the cavern wall, one that had likely formed during the attack. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough to squeeze through, but it led somewhere. Behind them, screams rang out as the last of the rebels made their final stand. Zyra's fists clenched, her breath ragged with frustration. We should be fighting. Ethan grabbed her wrist. We are fighting, just not here. She didn't like it. But she ran. The tunnel twisted sharply, winding downward deeper than Ethan thought possible. Then suddenly, it widened, and what lay beyond stole his breath. A vast underground archive, rows of stone shelves stretching into the darkness, each lined with ancient texts, glowing glyphs and relics untouched by time. Ethan's pulse quickened. What is this place? Oren stepped forward, placing a hand on one of the glowing symbols. The true history of Katal'Zir. Zyra turned to him, eyes still burning. And why did you bring us here? Oren's expression was unreadable. Because if you want to defeat Vekkar, he said, you need to understand what he's been hiding. Ethan's breath slowed. Something told him the war for Katal'Zir wasn't just about rebellion. It was about something much bigger. And they had just stepped into the heart of it. The archive stretched endlessly into the darkness. Its towering. Stone shelves filled with relics that pulsed with an eerie glow. The weight of history pressed down on Ethan as he followed Zyra and Oren deeper into the forgotten chambers of Katal'Zir. The air here felt different, charged, almost alive. It smelled of dust, old parchment, and something metallic, like a storm trapped beneath the earth. Ethan's fingers traced the edges of an ancient mural carved into the wall. It depicted figures, not like the people of Katal'Zir, but taller, with elongated limbs and strange luminous patterns on their skin. They stood beneath a great sun, hands raised in what looked like reverence. Then, in the next panel, the sun fractured. A jagged crack split the sky, fire rained down, the figures fell, and beneath them, deep underground, the city of Katal'Zir took shape. Ethan exhaled sharply. This isn't just a civilization that's always been underground. They came from the surface. Zyra stepped closer, her amber eyes scanning the murals with an intensity that bordered on desperation. This isn't what we were taught. Ethan turned to Oren. How long have you known? The elder stood still, his expression unreadable. Long enough. Ethan clenched his jaw. And Vekkar? Oren finally met his gaze. He has always known. Ethan's stomach twisted. Zyra ran a hand through her braids, stepping back as if trying to distance herself from the truth in front of her. We were told the surface was never ours, that we have always been here. Ethan's mind spun. Vekkar has been lying for centuries. But why? Then something caught his eye. A massive stone slab stood at the far end of the archive, covered in thick layers of dust. Unlike the murals, it wasn't just carved. It had writing, not in Katal'Zir's intricate glyphs, but something older, something jagged and angular. Ethan brushed off the dust. The words burned into the stone, made his blood run cold. The heart is not salvation. It is the last remnant of the fall. Ethan's pulse pounded. The heart of Katal'Zir wasn't a sacred artifact. It was a power core, and not just any power core. Something from the civilization that had come before. He turned back to Oren. This isn't a myth, the heart, it's failing because it was never meant to last. Oren nodded. It was a last effort to sustain what remained, but the damage had already been done. Zira inhaled sharply. So the prophecy, Ethan turned back to the murals, the crack in the sky, the collapse, the fire. The city wasn't just in danger. It was a time bomb. The prophecy wasn't just a warning about outsiders, it was a countdown. Ethan's throat tightened. If we don't find a way out, Katal'Zir isn't just going to fall. His voice was hoarse. It's going to be erased. Zira's hands curled into fists. Then we need to move. Oren's expression darkened. Vekkar will not let you. Ethan exhaled sharply. He doesn't have a choice. Oren's gaze was steady. That is where you are wrong. The realization settled over Ethan like Ice. Vekkar knew the heart was dying. He wasn't trying to save Katal'Zir. He was trying to bury it, and he would kill anyone who tried to stop him. The city of Katal'Zir trembled as the final battle began. Ethan sprinted through the winding corridors, his pulse hammering in his ears as the sounds of combat echoed around him. Clashing steel, shouted commands, the screams of the wounded. The rebellion had ignited, a storm surging through the ancient streets, and at its core stood Zira, leading her warriors against the enforcers. This was it, their last stand. The heart was failing, the city crumbling. And if they didn't stop, Vekkar, now there wouldn't be anything left to fight for. Zira spun through the chaos, her twin blades flashing in the bioluminescent light as she cut down an enforcer blocking their path. We push for the central chamber, she shouted. We end this at the throne. Ethan tightened his grip on his stolen blade. He wasn't a soldier, but he had learned how to survive. His mind worked differently, strategy over brute force. And right now, survival meant breaking through Vekkar's defenses before the city collapsed entirely. Oren moved beside him, slower but no less determined. The elder had finally chosen a side, though Ethan suspected it was not out of loyalty, but necessity. Vekkar will not retreat, Oren said grimly. He will fight until there is nothing left to rule. Then we take that choice away from him, Ethan said. They reached the main courtyard where rebel forces clashed against Vekkar's remaining enforcers. Smoke and dust hung thick in the air, lit by the eerie glow of the heart's energy pulsing. Through the walls, Ethan's gaze flicked to Zira. We need to get to the high chamber. If we cut off the leadership, the enforcers might break. Zira nodded. Then stay close. She led the charge. They fought their way through the chaos, Ethan dodging rather than attacking, using his agility to maneuver past the more heavily armored enforcers. The rebels followed Zira's ruthless precision, carving a path through the defenders. Then ahead, the throne room. The great doors stood open, leading to the massive chamber where Vekkar ruled from his obsidian dais. Ethan's breath caught as he took in the sight. Vekkar stood at the top of the steps, his long robes flowing like dark smoke, his expression eerily calm. His enforcers flanked him, weapons at the ready, but his eyes were locked on Ethan. Fools, Vekkar murmured. You think you are fighting for freedom. Zira lifted her blades. We fight for the truth. Vekkar exhaled slowly. And yet the truth will bury you all. Ethan's stomach dropped. Then he felt it. A deep, unnatural tremor beneath his feet. The entire chamber rumbled, a wave of displaced energy rippling through the walls. The bioluminescent veins flickered erratically, dimming, then pulsing brighter. The heart was failing, and someone had triggered it. Ethan turned, sharply as realization struck. Lena's search team. They had made it inside. They had triggered the collapse. Vekkar smiled coldly. You have delivered the final blow yourselves. Then he moved. Faster than Ethan expected, Vekkar lashed out, striking first, not at him, but at Oren. The elder barely had time to react before Vekkar's blade plunged into his side. Oren gasped, eyes widening. Ethan's breath caught. Zira roared, lunging forward, but Vekkar threw Oren's body toward her, forcing her to catch him. Ethan didn't think. He reacted. He sprinted up the steps, raising his stolen dagger, and drove it toward Vekkar's chest. Vekkar twisted at the last second, and Ethan's blade barely nicked his arm. The High Chancellor countered with a brutal backhand, sending Ethan sprawling across the cold stone. The chamber shook violently now. Cracks spiderwebbed across the floor. Zira knelt beside Oren, pressing a hand to his wound. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and final. Oren's fingers curled weakly around Zira's wrist. "It is done." His voice was faint, a whisper nearly swallowed by the chaos. "You must choose." Zira's jaw clenched, her expression a mask of grief and fury. "I choose to fight." Oren exhaled his last breath. Ethan pushed himself up, vision swimming. Vekkar was already turning toward the heart's core chamber, retreating. "He's running." Ethan rasped. Zira's knuckles turned white around her blades. Not for long. They chased him. Through crumbling halls, past collapsing pillars, until they reached the final chamber. The heart of Katal'Zir loomed before them, flickering dangerously, its energy unstable. Vekkar stood before it, hands outstretched. "You will not take this from me," he whispered. Zira's voice was raw with rage. "You would rather let it all burn?" Vekkar's eyes darkened. "If Katal'Zir cannot belong to me, it will belong to no one." The heart pulsed erratically. Ethan's mind raced. "If it collapses now, we die here." Then, an opening. Zira lunged. Her blade struck true, plunging deep into Vekkar's chest. The High Chancellor gasped, his hands trembling as he staggered back. Blood dripped from his lips as he stared at Zira, something like disbelief flickering in his fading gaze. "You don't understand." His body crumpled, and the heart screamed. A surge of energy erupted from the core, a shockwave that sent Ethan and Zira flying. The chamber walls cracked. The city itself began to collapse. Ethan scrambled to his feet, grabbing Zira. "We have to go now." She hesitated, her gaze flicking back to the heart. It was over. Vekkar was dead, but Katal'Zir was dying with him. They ran. The tunnels caved behind them, stone crashing down as the ancient city devoured itself. Ethan didn't look back. His only thought was escape, to the surface, or to the grave. The first tremor hit like a hammer striking the bones of the earth. Ethan barely kept his footing as the shockwave rippled through the chamber, sending cracks racing up the ancient walls. The heart of Katal'Zir pulsed wildly, its glow no longer rhythmic but erratic, unstable. Energy flared from its core, raw and violent, illuminating the dust-choked air in flashes of burning white light. Then came the sound, a deep, resonant roar, not from a creature, but from the city itself. The stone beneath their feet shuddered, as if awakening from a centuries-old slumber. Ethan turned, his mind snapping to a single urgent thought. "We have to get out." Zira was already moving, shouting orders to the rebels. "Fall back to the tunnels, move, now!" The enforcers, without Vekkar's command, were no longer fighting. They were fleeing. Panic spread through the streets as the realization set in. Katal'Zir was dying. Ethan grabbed Zira's arm. "We need to get the civilians out too." She hesitated, but only for a moment. Then she nodded. "We split up. You get to the lower districts, I'll take the rebels toward the western tunnels." Another tremor rocked the city, sending debris crashing down from the cavern ceiling. A massive stone column buckled, snapping, in half before slamming into the ground, shattering on impact. They had minutes, maybe less. Ethan sprinted toward the lower districts, his lungs burning with dust and effort. The air was filled with screams now, families trying to flee, children crying as parents clutched them close, elders frozen in fear as the world crumbled around them. A woman reached for him, desperation in her eyes. "Please." He grasped her wrist, pulling her along. "Keep moving, don't stop." More people followed. Soon he had a group of nearly 20 trailing behind him, scrambling over fallen debris as the city caved in around them. The tunnels. He had to find the tunnels. A piercing crack split the air. Ethan spun just in time to see the heart itself, its pulsing form flickering violently, unleash another pulse of energy. The entire structure shuddered, then caved inward slightly, and standing before it motionless was Vekkar. Ethan's breath caught. The High Chancellor, bleeding from his wounds, stood with his back to the chaos, his gaze fixed on the dying heart. His robes were torn, his expression unreadable. Ethan took a step forward. "Vekkar, we have to go." Vekkar didn't turn. "This power," he murmured, almost to himself. "It was never meant for us." Another tremor. The heart pulsed again, sending out waves of heat. Vekkar exhaled. "Go, outsider." Ethan clenched his jaw. "You can still—" "I will die as I have lived," Vekkar interrupted. "With my city." Ethan hesitated only a second longer. Then, he ran. The tunnels. He had to reach the tunnels. By the time he reached Zyra and the surviving rebels, the destruction had worsened. Massive fissures split the ground, swallowing entire buildings into the abyss below. Fires burned where they shouldn't. Oxygen from unknown sources feeding flames that licked up the cavern walls. Zyra spotted him immediately. "The tunnels are ahead, but they're caving in fast." Ethan turned back. People were still trying to reach them. Civilians, rebels, stragglers. Zyra's hand clenched around his arm. "Ethan, we can't save them all." His stomach twisted. Another section of the city collapsed, sending a cloud of dust and fire into the air. Oren, his robes stained with blood, staggered toward them, his face pale. "I can slow it." Ethan's chest tightened. "No. You come with us." Oren shook his head. "If the tunnels collapse completely, no one escapes." His eyes met Ethan's. "This is how it must be." Ethan's throat burned. "Oren." The elder lifted a trembling hand and pressed it to Ethan's shoulder. "Go." Zyra grabbed Ethan's wrist, pulling him toward the tunnel entrance. The last thing Ethan saw before the cavern consumed itself was Oren, standing before the heart, his hands raised as if whispering to the power that had sustained them for so long. Then the tunnels closed behind them, and Katal'Zir was gone. They ran through the darkness, the weight of the past collapsing behind them. Ethan didn't look back. He couldn't. All he could do now was move forward, toward whatever waited beyond. The earth groaned around them, a deep guttural sound that sent dust and loose stones cascading from the fractured ceiling. The tunnels were ancient, long forgotten, their walls lined with remnants of a civilization that had hidden beneath the world for centuries. Ethan could feel the weight of Katal'Zir behind him, the loss, the destruction, the lives that had been swallowed by the collapse. But there was no time to mourn. Not yet. He tightened his grip on the torch in his hand, its flickering light casting jagged shadows along the tunnel walls. The surviving rebels moved in tense silence behind him, their faces streaked with sweat and dust. Zyra was at his side, her expression unreadable, though he could see the tightness in her jaw, the barely contained grief in her eyes. They had lost everything, but they were still alive. Ahead, the tunnel split into two passageways. Both dark, both unstable. Zyra exhaled sharply. Which way? Ethan hesitated, his mind spinning. If they chose wrong, they could end up trapped, buried alive in the ruins of a lost world. Then, a faint crackle. His communicator. Ethan nearly dropped the torch in his scramble to unclip the battered device from his belt. Static hissed through. The speaker warped and broken, but... "Than, you copy? Damn it." Lena, Ethan's breath caught. He adjusted the frequency, his fingers shaking. "Lena, I'm here, we're here." More static. Then, "Jesus, Ethan, where the hell are you?" The relief in her voice hit him like a punch to the chest. He exhaled shakily. "Still underground, trying to get out." Zyra stepped closer, eyes locked on the device as if she could will it to explain itself. Lena's voice crackled through the speaker again. We found an opening. A collapse. There's a cave system leading down. We're moving in, but the structure's unstable. Ethan clenched his jaw. They're inside. Zyra swore under her breath. If they dig too deep, they'll bury us and themselves. Ethan turned to the survivors. We need to move. Now. He didn't wait for an answer. He bolted toward the left tunnel, the one that sloped upward. The others followed, their footfalls echoing in the tight space. Every step sent, loose gravel tumbling beneath their boots. Another tremor rattled the tunnel, stronger this time. Zyra cursed. It's coming down! A deafening crack split the air behind them. Ethan turned just in time to see the rear section of the passage collapse, sealing off their escape route to Katal'Zir forever. No turning back now. Dust filled the air, burning. Ethan's lungs as he forced himself forward. The tunnel narrowed, the walls pressing in. Then, ahead, a sliver of light. The sight nearly knocked the breath from his lungs. Go! He shouted. The survivors surged forward, desperation in their movements. The exit was close, so close. Then the tunnel collapsed again. Ethan dove, shielding his head as debris rained down, cutting them off from the last few feet of open space. A heartbeat of silence, then, coughing, gasping, Ethan pushed himself up, feeling the raw scrape of stone against his palms, the way out blocked. No, 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 he muttered, shoving at the debris. It was too heavy, packed too tightly. Zyra moved beside him, pressing a hand against the stone. We're not dying here. She drove her blade into a weakened section, prying at the cracks. Ethan followed her lead, shoving at the loose points, ignoring the pain in his hands. The others joined in. The rock shifted. Ethan heaved, muscles straining. A break. Light poured through. Cool, fresh air rushed in, washing over them in a wave. Then, hands, reaching through the gap. Lena's voice, sharp, with urgency. I've got you, Ethan, take my hand. He barely had time to register the moment before he was pulled forward, out of the suffocating darkness, and into the blinding light of the surface. Ethan collapsed onto solid ground, his breath ragged, his body shaking. He turned, watching as Zyra and the others emerged behind him, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and awe. For the first time in her life, Zyra stood beneath the open sky. She stared up, her amber eyes wide as she took in the endless stretch of blue, the towering trees swaying in the wind. Her breath caught in her throat. Ethan pushed himself up. We made it. Lena crouched beside him, scanning his face, taking in the exhaustion, the blood, the weight of everything he had been through. Her voice was softer now. Yeah, but now what? Ethan turned to the survivors. Zyra, the rebels, the people who had followed him out of the depths. They had escaped, but the world wasn't ready for them, and the real battle was just beginning. Ethan stumbled forward, his boots sinking into soft earth, the world blindingly bright after so many days in the dark. The air was clean, crisp with the scent of damp leaves and sun-warmed stone. A breeze cut through the trees, cool against his sweat-streaked skin. His breath hitched. They had made it. Zyra stood beside him, silent, unmoving. She was staring at the sky, her amber eyes wide, reflecting the endless stretch of blue above them. The wind caught in her dark braids, lifting them slightly, and for a moment she looked utterly lost. Not in fear, in disbelief. Behind them, the last of the survivors emerged, blinking against the sudden brightness. Some shielded their eyes. Others touched the ground hesitantly as if it might not be real. Ethan turned, scanning the jungle beyond, and froze. They weren't alone. Lena's team had already arrived. A cluster of figures stood at the tree line, half hidden by the undergrowth. They weren't soldiers, just researchers, explorers, people who had followed rumors and whispers of something hidden beneath the rainforest. Cameras hung around their necks, radio equipment strapped to their backs, and they were staring. One of them, a man in his late 30s with a sunburned face, fumbled for his camera. Zyra saw it and reacted. In a blur, she unsheathed one of her blades, stepping between her people and the outsiders. The rebels followed suit, forming a defensive line. Ethan's stomach dropped. "Wait, stop!" The man froze mid-motion, hands trembling over his camera. Zyra's voice was like steel. "Put it down." Lena was already moving, shoving the man's arm down before he could take the shot. "Jesus, Greg, are you trying to get yourself killed?" Ethan exhaled shakily. "We don't need this right now." Greg swallowed hard, raising his hands. His eyes darted over the survivors. "Who the hell are they?" No one answered. Lena's gaze snapped to Ethan. Her relief was evident, but so was the tension in her stance. "Talk to me." Ethan wiped a hand over his face, exhaustion pulling at him. He didn't even know where to begin. "We found something," he said. "Or, it found me." Lena's eyes flicked past him, taking in Zyra, the rebels, the worn-down, dust-covered people who looked like they had stepped out of another time. "This," she hesitated, shaking her head. "This is bigger than anything we've ever seen." Ethan exhaled. "Yeah." Greg took a cautious step forward. "Listen, I don't know what's happening here, but this..." He gestured to the survivors. "This changes everything." Zyra's grip tightened around her blade. "We are not an exhibit." Ethan stepped between them before things could escalate further. "No one is taking pictures," he said firmly, locking eyes with Greg. "No one is writing stories. Not yet." Greg scoffed. "Are you serious? This is the biggest discovery of the century. People need to know." Zyra's blade was at his throat before he could finish. The world went silent. Greg stiffened, eyes darting wildly to Ethan. Zyra's voice was ice. "Your world has done nothing but take. I will not let you take us." Ethan's pulse pounded. "Zyra, don't." For a moment he wasn't sure she would listen. Then slowly she lowered her weapon. Greg let out a shaky breath, stumbling backward. "Jesus." Lena took a cautious step toward Ethan, lowering her voice. "We can't hide this." Ethan clenched his jaw. "We might not have a choice." Lena's gaze softened. "You don't just come back from something like this." He knew that. But this wasn't just his story anymore, it was theirs, and the world was watching. The survivors of Katal'Zir weren't free. They had traded one prison for another. Ethan sat on the edge of a sterile cot, his fingers tapping restlessly against his knee as he scanned the dimly lit room. The walls were white, reinforced steel. No windows. Cameras sat in the corners, their red indicator lights blinking. The air smelled of antiseptic, cold and clinical. A research outpost, a containment facility. He could hear the low murmur of voices through the walls, the distant hum of machinery, the faint rustle of movement from the next room over. Zyra was in there, with the others. Observed, studied, not as survivors, not as people, as specimens. Ethan ran a hand over his face, exhaustion pressing down on him. He had fought to get them out, had risked everything to bring them to the surface, only to watch them be locked away the moment they emerged. Zyra had barely looked at him since they arrived. Sharp metallic click broke through his thoughts. The door unlocked. Lena stepped in, looking tired, her expression tense. She shut the door behind her and leaned against it, arms crossed. Ethan met her gaze. "Tell me this isn't what it looks like." Lena exhaled. "I tried." Ethan stood. "Tried? You said we'd keep this quiet, that they'd be safe." Lena's jaw tightened. "You don't just walk out of the jungle with an entire civilization and expect the world to ignore it." Ethan's stomach twisted. "So what happens now?" Lena rubbed her temples. "For now, they're being observed, medically assessed. No press, no media, no leaks, but that won't last. The moment someone figures out what they really are..." Ethan's pulse pounded. "They'll never be free." Lena didn't argue. A beat of silence. Then, another click. The door opened again. Zyra, her amber eyes burned with quiet fury as she stepped inside, flanked by two guards. Her wrists were free, but Ethan could see the tension in her stance, the way her fingers twitched as if resisting the urge to reach for a weapon that wasn't there. The guards lingered in the doorway, watching. Ethan's throat tightened. Zyra. She ignored him, turning to Lena. What do your people want? Lena hesitated. Answers. Zyra scoffed. We are not riddles for them to solve. Ethan swallowed hard. Zyra, Her gaze snapped to him, sharp as a blade. You led us here. The words hit harder than he expected. Lena shifted uncomfortably. I'm trying to keep this under control. Zyra's voice was cold. We were free before you found us. Ethan clenched his jaw. No, you weren't. Zyra stepped closer. We were not prisoners. Ethan didn't back down. You were dying. A flicker of something passed through her expression. She knew that, but it didn't make this any easier. Lena cleared her throat. We don't have time for this. If word gets out, this place won't just have scientists. It'll have military, governments, corporations. Every power in the world will want a piece of this. Zyra exhaled slowly. Then we must leave. Lena hesitated. It's not that simple. Zyra turned back to Ethan. Do you understand, now, why we stayed hidden? Ethan ran a hand through his hair. I get it. His voice was hoarse. But we're here now. We have to figure out what's next. Zyra was silent for a long moment. Then, Vekkar was right. Ethan's breath caught. Zyra shook her head. Not about his rule, not about his cruelty, but about this. She gestured to the sterile room, the blinking cameras, the world beyond these walls. He feared what would happen if outsiders found us. And now we are animals in a cage. Ethan's stomach twisted. He had spent so much time fighting Vekkar's control that he had never considered what came after. Lena exhaled. So what's the plan? Zyra's gaze didn't waver. We vanish. Ethan frowned. How? Zyra turned to Lena. You got us in here. Get us out. Lena's brows furrowed. Do you have any idea how many security protocols? Zyra's voice was steady. I do not care. Lena glanced at Ethan as if expecting him to argue. He didn't, because Zyra was right. If they stayed, they would be studied. If they were studied, they would be claimed. They couldn't let that happen. Ethan took a deep breath. We erase Katal'Zir. Lena's brows lifted. Ethan nodded, the weight of the decision settling over him. If we leave any trace, they'll keep looking. We don't just escape, we make sure no one can ever find it again. Lena's expression was unreadable. You're talking about erasing an entire history. Ethan exhaled. I'm talking about giving them a future. A silence stretched between them. Then Lena sighed. All right. She looked at Zyra. If we do this, there's no going back. Zyra's expression was unwavering. There is nothing to go back to. Lena nodded slowly. Then she stepped forward. Let's get to work. The rain had started again, a slow drizzle that dampened the earth and blurred the edges of the security lights lining the research outpost's perimeter. It was the perfect cover. Ethan crouched beside the outer fence, his pulse steady despite the weight of what he was about to do. Behind him, the survivors of Katal'Zir waited in tense silence, their eyes flickering between the jungle beyond and the sterile prison they were about to leave behind. Zyra stood at his side, arms crossed, watching him closely. You're sure about this? She murmured. Ethan exhaled. No, but I'm doing it anyway. He pulled a modified device from his pocket, a small handheld transmitter Lena had smuggled to him. It wasn't sophisticated, but it would do the job. A single press sent a disruption through the security feed, creating a loop. To anyone watching, the cameras would show nothing but an empty field. It would only last 5 minutes. They had to move. Ethan gestured. Go. Now. The group slipped through the breach in the fence one by one, sticking low to the ground, moving quickly and without hesitation. Lena had done her part. She had rerouted the guards on patrol, left just enough gaps in the security system for them to slip through unnoticed. If anyone noticed her tampering later, she would deny everything. Ethan was the last to move. He hesitated just for a moment before slipping through the fence after them. No alarms, no pursuit. They were in the jungle before anyone knew they were. Gone. The rainforest closed around them like a living thing, dense, damp, filled with the hum of insects and the distant cries of nocturnal creatures. It was familiar territory for Ethan, but not for the survivors. They moved like ghosts, silent but wary, scanning the terrain as if expecting the world itself to betray them. Ethan led the way. They traveled for miles, putting as much distance between themselves and the outpost as possible. There were no trails here, no landmarks, just raw wilderness. But that was the point. By morning, they would be nothing more than a rumor. Zira walked beside him, moving with ease through the undergrowth, despite having never stepped foot in the jungle before. Her eyes were sharp, her body alert, but there was something else there, something unspoken. They stopped at a river's edge to refill their canteens. Ethan knelt, running his fingers through the cool water. "We should split up after this." Zira didn't answer at first. She just watched the surface of the river as if searching for meaning in the reflection of the trees. Finally, she spoke. "And what will you do?" Ethan shrugged. "Disappear, same as you." Zira exhaled. "Not the same." Ethan looked at her. Her gaze was unreadable. "You will return to your world. I will keep my people safe in ours." He nodded slowly. "You don't have to worry about me coming back." She studied him for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she smirked. Just a little. "I wasn't worried." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. Zira's expression sobered. "You were right, Ethan. Katal'Zir was dying. But so was our way of life. The truth is, we were never meant to stay underground, forever." She looked toward the jungle. "The future is uncertain, but at least it is ours to decide." Ethan swallowed against the tightness in his throat. "Yeah." She hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached into the pouch at her side and pulled something out. A small carved pendant, weathered, ancient, the sigil of Katal'Zir etched into the surface. She pressed it into his hand. "A reminder," she said. Ethan closed his fingers around it. Then, without another word, Zira turned and walked away. The others followed. And just like that, they were gone. By the time Ethan returned to civilization, the rumors had already begun. A leaked report, a mysterious underground ruin somewhere deep in the Amazon. But no concrete evidence, no artifacts, no survivors, just whispers. Lena met him at the edge of the nearest town, a cigarette dangling from her fingers, her expression wary. "You actually pulled it off," she muttered. Ethan exhaled. "Yeah." Lena studied him. "And you? What happens now?" Ethan smirked. "I disappear, remember?" Lena scoffed. "You wish." She took a long drag, then exhaled. "They'll keep looking, you know. The world always looks for legends." Ethan's gaze drifted toward the horizon. "Let them look." He slipped the pendant into his pocket. Some things were never meant to be found. The world wanted answers. Ethan refused to give them. His phone buzzed endlessly with missed calls, emails, interview requests, and offers, some lucrative, others more threatening. News outlets ran with the story, dissecting every second of the footage he had released. Adventure vlogger falls into the unknown, but what did he find? Ethan Cross resurfaces after vanishing in the Amazon, silent about what he saw. A hoax or the greatest discovery never told? Theories spread like wildfire. The video had cut off just before the truth, and that gap was all the internet needed to invent its own version of what had happened. Some thought he had discovered an ancient city. Others believed he had been abducted. A few were convinced it was an elaborate PR stunt. Ethan ignored them all. The coffee shop was too quiet for his liking. He had taken to avoiding public places lately, but he needed air, needed to be anywhere but his apartment staring at the walls. Lena slid into the seat across from him, setting her coffee down with a sigh. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. You know this isn't going away, right? Ethan took a sip of his coffee, watching steam curl from the surface. It will, eventually. Lena scoffed. You think the world's just gonna forget? Ethan met her gaze. I think I made sure they never find what they're looking for. She studied him for a long moment. He could see the questions behind her eyes, the same ones she had been holding back since their escape. Why not tell them, Ethan? Her voice was softer now. You could control the story. You could tell it right. Ethan exhaled, leaning back in his seat. And then what? They'd send expeditions. They'd search until they found something, or until they made up something, to satisfy their curiosity. Lena frowned. You don't owe the world anything, but you owe yourself the truth. Ethan looked down at his hands. I know the truth, he said quietly. Lena hesitated. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a thick leather notebook, sliding it across the table. You keep dodging the press, but I know you, Ethan. You've been writing, thinking about telling it, even if you won't admit it. He didn't deny it. He had started drafting a memoir. He had filled pages with memories of Katal'Zir, of the people he had left behind. But every time he neared the moment where the real story began, he stopped. Because what was the point of telling half the truth? Lena sighed. So what now? You just disappear? Ethan didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted to the pendant hanging around his neck, the worn sigil of Katal'Zir pressed against his chest. Finally, he said, Yeah. Lena exhaled sharply, shaking her head. But there was no frustration in her eyes, only understanding. Guess I should have seen that coming, she muttered. Ethan smirked faintly. Yeah? She studied him for a moment longer, then stood, slinging, her bag over her shoulder. Take care of yourself, Cross, she said. Ethan nodded. You too. Then she was gone. And just like that, another piece of his old life faded away. That night, Ethan sat at his desk, staring at his laptop screen. The remaining footage, the real footage, still sat on his hard drive untouched. He had never watched it again after leaving the jungle, because deep down he knew that if he did, he'd be tempted to tell the world, tempted to break the promise he had made. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. One keystroke. That was all it would take to erase it forever. He hesitated. Then he deleted it. Gone. The last record of Katal'Zir, wiped from existence. Ethan closed the laptop, exhaling slowly. Outside, the city lights pulsed, endless and artificial. The world kept moving, kept searching, kept wanting to know. But some mysteries weren't meant to be solved, and some secrets weren't meant to be found. The world had moved on, but the legend had not. Ethan had spent the last few months fading into anonymity, shedding his old life piece by piece. No more vlogs, no more expeditions, no more chasing the unknown. Now he lived in a small, nameless town along the coastline, a place where the waves drowned out the noise of the world. His days were quiet. Early mornings with coffee on the porch, long walks along the beach, the kind of life he never would have chosen before. But now, it felt like exactly where he needed to be. Still, the world hadn't forgotten him. He had stopped checking the internet, but that didn't stop the headlines from finding him. Lost city in the Amazon? Mysterious team vanishes while searching for Katal'Zir. The Ethan Cross conspiracy. What is he hiding? Did this man discover an ancient civilization and cover it up? People were still searching. They always would. Ethan. At them. A sign from the past one morning, he went for his usual walk along the beach. The tide had pulled back, leaving behind stretches of smooth, untouched sand, and in the middle of it, a symbol, etched carefully, precisely. Ethan froze. It was impossible, but there it was, the sigil of Katal'Zir. His pulse picked up, but not in fear, in understanding. Someone had been here. Someone had left him a message. He turned sharply, scanning the sparse crowd along the boardwalk. Just fishermen, a few travelers, locals who barely acknowledged him. But then, a figure, standing at the edge of the street, half hidden by the morning mist. Hooded, watching. For a moment, Ethan thought he recognized the stance. The way the figure held themselves, the quiet confidence, Zira, or someone like her. Then, they were gone. Ethan didn't chase after them, didn't call out. He just stood there staring at the symbol in the sand, feeling something settle inside. Him. Katal'Zir wasn't gone. Not completely. It had simply rewritten itself, and for the first time Ethan felt at peace. He turned back toward the ocean, letting the waves carry away the questions he no longer needed answered. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved, some stories weren't meant to be told. But that didn't mean they didn't live on. And as Ethan walked away, leaving the sigil, undisturbed in the sand, he smiled. Because this time he wasn't the one chasing the legend. The legend had found him. The end. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.